thank you for coming. As always, we're delighted to have you, and especially delighted to have our friend Esley Hamilton. Somebody said yesterday, well, how did you meet Esley? And as Esley arrived today, I was thinking, how did we meet? I'm not sure, but we've known each other a long time now.
Yeah.
Esley's a wonderful historian. His knowledge is unbelievable. And I won't say anything more, but welcome. We're happy to have you, Esley.
Well, thank you, Vi. Vi and I agreed that I would dust off a talk that I gave about 20 years ago about homes of the presidents. Front porch and log cabin, the presidential home and the presidential image. Up until the latter part of the 20th century, the people who didn't have all the wealth of audio-visual data available to them that we have today were very interested in seeing pictures of where their presidential candidates lived. And if the person was popular, those houses became shrines that they visited, then in later years also. And starting in the 1850s with Mount Vernon, which was saved from complete ruin, I think, by a women's association led by a woman from South Carolina. And then in the mid-20th century, the National Park Service got involved in saving presidential homes also. So the flyer that I've given you lists all of the presidential sites that are part of the National Park System, plus all the sites that have been recognized by the Interior Department as National Historic Landmarks, which are not federally owned properties, which are nationally significant. And they're pretty strict about what makes national significance. For example, usually a presidential birthplace is not considered the most significant building associated with the president. It's the place where he did his work, where important events of his life took place. And often a president's family moved on shortly after their birth to another place. And this was a big change in thinking at the time because in the early years it was the birthplace that everybody was most interested in. But so there's still quite a few privately owned birthplaces, including still Mount Vernon is not owned by the federal government. And then, and as well as state-owned and municipally owned. And the next thing on the list is presidential libraries. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was the first president to organize his papers into a building on the grounds of his home in New York and give that whole complex to the National Archives. And subsequently, every president has done that, and the previous president, Herbert Hoover, also established a presidential library on the site of his birthplace in Iowa. There are other places now that has become a popular institution that are called presidential libraries. For example, in Springfield, Illinois, there's the Lincoln Library, which is actually a state-owned agency, but it's not under the control of the National Archives, so it's not on this list. There's one in Fredericksburg, Virginia, that's associated with James Monroe also, and there's one in Akron, Ohio, associated with McKinley, but those are private, different organizations. So we have a range now of properties associated with every president, and this makes us unique among democracies in the world. That in England, for example, they have an agency that deals with historic palaces, but there are only 4 out of the 50-some prime ministers whose houses are preserved. by, in that case, private foundations. And they're not necessarily the most important. That just by the luck of the draw, their houses happen to be preserved. And it's true in other places around the world also. It's usually the head of state rather than the head of the government who is commemorated. So it's a very American thing. And there are different ways that they're used. In the presidential election of 1876 was between Samuel Tilden of New York City and Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. And Tilden lived in a beautiful architect-designed house facing Gramercy Park, which at that time was one of the most fashionable places to live. Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace was just a block away from there, for example. And Tilden was a philanthropist who had given money to build the great New York Public Library also. But he lost the election. It was, at that time, the most contentious election that we'd ever had. And his house is only survived because he bequeathed it to the Arts Club, and it still is a private club today. In fact, if you read Antiques magazine, they had an article about it just in the last issue, which was a big surprise. It had taken me years to find these pictures showing what it looked like. By contrast, Spiegel Grove, which was Hayes's house, is a state-owned historic site. It's not architecturally significant, but it's huge, as you can see. It started at less than half the size that it eventually grew to. And he left papers there also, so it's a research center also. During presidential campaigns, more so before modern media than today, the images of the president or the presidential candidate were used in their campaign. And one of the most famous ones, of course, is Harrison, William Henry Harrison. They called him Tippy Canoe, and the slogan for his ticket was Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. John Tyler was his running mate. And this is a page from some sheet music, a dance piece called The Whigs of the United States, or the Harrison Quadrille. And on the left, you can see the log cabin. And he was so associated with log cabins that people had model log cabins that they carried in parades at his campaign rallies. And the U.S. Capitol, as it was in 1840, is on the right. But in reality, the only time he had lived in a log cabin was when he was on military assignment. He was associated with the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was in Indiana, but that had been taken place nearly 40 years before. So they really had to dredge up something to get people to know who he was. But in reality, he had been born in Berkeley Plantation on the James River in Virginia. His father was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and his grandfather was King Carter, who was the richest man in the colonies at the time, and whose family built big mansions all over Virginia. And even in his work, which was mainly for the military, he lived in nice houses. This is Grouseland, which was his home when he was the governor of the whole Northwest Territory, based in Vincennes, Indiana. And this was, it survived, but it was only fully restored about 30 years ago with this beautiful portico. By contrast, a lot of people who had who didn't have money wanted to beautify and embellish their houses so that they looked more successful. And that's what happened in the case of Andrew Jackson. Jackson was also a military hero. Of course, the Battle of New Orleans was the thing he was mainly successful for. But he had started out dirt poor. In fact, the place where he was born was somewhere between North Carolina and South Carolina, and nobody's really sure which state he was born in. It was so remote. And even when he moved to Nashville, Tennessee, he lived in a complex of log buildings until fairly late in his career. And when he built the Hermitage, which is the magnificent house outside Nashville that he's associated with now, it was actually more modest than it appears, because the portico wasn't added until his last year in the White House, and it's really a false front, which you can see at the top there. The proportions of the portico don't match the proportions of the house behind it. The idea of humble beginnings, though, tended to become a predominant image for presidents, or the one that they wanted to promote the most, not the fact that they came from affluence, if they did, although they wanted to show that they had been successful in their own lives. And of course, the most famous example of that is Abraham Lincoln's birthplace in Hodgenville, Kentucky. And he was known as Abe the Rail Splitter. He had actually worked cutting logs in the pioneer areas where he had lived, beginning in Kentucky and then in Indiana and southern Illinois. And we have today Lincoln's New Salem, north of Springfield, is a whole town of log cabins where he worked initially before he moved to the state capital. The Lincoln birthplace is a notorious example of a false historic site because, first of all, nobody really knows if this is the cabin that he was born in, because his parents moved away when he was quite small, and the subsequent owners of that property didn't build another house on that site. So when he began to become famous, they just, as people tend to do, asked the oldest person in the neighborhood, where was Abraham Lincoln born, and he pointed to this pile of logs and said that was the place. So they restored it, but then they moved it twice, and I believe in the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, it was moved, and it was shown in a setting next to the Ulysses S. Grant's headquarters building at the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia, which was also a log cabin. And when the celebration was over in 1876, they took both cabins apart and put all the logs in one wagon. And so the next place, the building was twice as large as it had started out being. So they, in order to give this site in Kentucky a little bit more glamour, in 1911, they had John Russell Pope, who was one of the leading architects in America and who was later to design the Thomas Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., to design this shelter, really, is what it is for the birthplace. I can't imagine the Mrs. Lincoln carrying water up that staircase if it was actually on that height when, here, I'm looking at a picture that you can't see. Right there. It's really pretty grand. So now they call this, the National Park Service calls this a traditional birthplace site, and tries not to emphasize whether the log cabin is the original building or not. And because of our early experiences with these shrines to presidents, that people who were local boosters began to realize that if you could associate your town with the president, it would help your economy. People would think you're a prosperous community and more people would come to visit you. And so here's a wonderful example. This is a billboard outside of Dixon, Illinois, which is the northwest part of Illinois. It says, "Home of Hay Brothers Ice Cream and President Ronald Reagan." And I think that still is true today. But there was one period of American history where the homes of the presidents actually played a central role in the campaign for the presidency. And that was the front porch era, which started in 1880 with Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock. Garfield lived on the main, this is a picture of McKinley sitting on his front porch, but it's a good example. This is Garfield's house in Mentor, Ohio, and the railroad company that went to Cleveland built a branch line that went to a little station in the back field behind Garfield's house, and thousands of people visited there and went through the field to the house, and he would come out on this porch and speak to them. Winfield Scott Hancock was the commander of the Eastern Army, which was based in during that campaign period in 1880 in the Governor's Island in New York Harbor, and so nobody could get to him, and because it was a military base. And so Garfield won by a relatively small margin. I think 10,000 people. So this is. Afterward, they said this is the way to go, and up until then, in the middle of the 1920s and 30s, that was the way presidents campaigned. And this is how the house looked in the 1950s. I think this was during the period of reaction to Victorian architecture when they painted all Victorian buildings white. But this is really the color that it should have been. And this picture shows the side of the house also, which shows this, let's see, I'm not sure, this is not showing anything. Oh, I went backward, I'm sorry. The wing of the house to the right is stone. And that was built after Garfield's death by his widow, who was a very well-educated woman, and his son, who was an architect, a practicing architect in California. And they made that a memorial library. And that was really the first presidential library. And now the property is owned by the National Park Service. The next presidential campaign was Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, and you can see from this picture that he actually rebuilt the porch so it looked a little more glamorous for the front porch speeches he was giving. The house was built probably in the late 1860s or 1870s, which was a boom period for Indianapolis, but the classical ionic columns of the porch were added later. And then this is McKinley's house in Canton, Ohio, with the picture that we saw earlier. And this is one of the few presidential homes that was torn down. It was in the way in the 1930s of expansion of the next door hospital. And you can't argue with hospitals about historic preservation because they're saving lives. So it was torn down, and there still is no home where McKinley actually lived or owned, but the home of his wife's family is still standing in Canton, and that has been restored recently as a home, as a museum for first ladies, and there's actually a library there also, and it's you can see it's decorated with the bunting because he used this for his first front porch campaign in 1896. He was not a wealthy person, although his wife's family were pretty affluent. And so when he was also paying for a house in Washington, D.C., he just stayed with them in Ohio when he went back to campaign. So this is an interesting save for historic preservationists. And one of the last active front porch campaigns was Warren Harding, who defeated Cox, James Cox. Cox went on though to own the Cox Publishing Company, which is one of the biggest ones and still is in the United States, and he made millions of dollars, so he didn't suffer too badly. And they still have the wicker furniture on the Harding House front porch. Another important image that presidents had from the early period was a rural image of a plantation or a homestead or some other kind of non-urban setting. And especially in the later 20th century, a lot of presidents purchased or rented vacation homes to use while they were president, to emphasize that away from the city image. And of course, this was starting with Mount Vernon, which was originally inherited with a much smaller house on it by George Washington from his brother, and expanded over, oh dear, I don't know why that expanded that way. Anyway, we'll enjoy it. It expanded over time until it was really one of the largest and most impressive houses. Now I can't get this to go forward or backward. Let's see. I don't know what I did. It won't go forward, backward, it just goes up and down.
There you go. Now try it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. There you go.
All right. I don't know what you hit that I wasn't hitting.
Or you can use your clicker again.
It didn't do anything. Let's see. Okay.
Okay.
All right. This is the front. And the great thing about this is it's been an image that's been repeated for 2 centuries now. Some of you may remember motels and restaurants along the highway that were models after Mount Vernon. But if you look closely, it's not the highest quality architecture. The windows are not lined up at all. And they're spaced differently between the first floor and the second floor also. But it still remained a pretty impressive house. And of course, Monticello was one of the first buildings in the United States that was internationally known as, and still by many architectural historians is considered one of the first buildings in the United States of international architectural quality. James Madison, who lived in the next county north from Jefferson, is said to have had Jefferson advise him on the portico of this house when he expanded it from a smaller house that his father had built. And fortunately, after this had been much changed, after Paul Mellon died, the great philanthropist who gave so many important paintings to our National Gallery of Art in Washington, he left a special fund for the restoration of Montpelier. So it looks the best now that it ever has. And then Madison's successor, Monroe, had 2 houses. in this area. One was a smaller house near Monticello and Charlottesville, and Oak Hill is a house in Loudoun County, which is now one of the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C., which he could get to more easily when he was working as a diplomat, or when he later became president, which was most of his life. And one of the strange things about this is you see it has 5 columns on this portico that faces the garden, and that's not classical. Classical temples always had an even number of columns. But it's very logical because it means that the windows behind the portico have unbroken views of the garden. And then after the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson was the first president who hailed from the South, almost 50 years after the end of the war. And this was the house he was born in Staunton, Virginia, which was actually the Presbyterian manse for the First Presbyterian Church of Staunton. Very elegant. But really, at the time of his election, this is the house he lived in, a Tudor Revival suburban house that he had designed himself when he was a professor at Princeton University in New Jersey. And he was actually elected president as governor of New Jersey, a northern state. Another category of early presidential homes, and really going up to modern times, is the New England homestead. This is the custom that many old families in New England had of just expanding their house as their family grew and as more generations came, and also of keeping the house as a center point, a focal point for the family, even though the later generations may have scattered all over the country. And the first example is that is the house on the left, where John and Abigail Adams gave birth to John Quincy Adams, our 5th president. And this on the left is where John Adams was born, his father's home. And then the house on the right, which was just built in the next lot, was where he and Abigail gave birth to John Quincy Adams. And Quincy is a town just south of Boston, in part of the metropolitan area. And as this is how the houses have been restored, and as they earned more money, John and Abigail were able to buy this house, which was not as big when they first bought it. It had where the door is on the right, there were 2 windows on either side, and all the rest of it was added later. And this was still in the family and into the 20th century. Peacefield is the name they used for it, and this is where John Adams died in 1826 at the age of 90. He was the first former president to become a nonagenarian, and the last one until Hoover. Since then, there have been 3 others. Franklin Pierce also came from a homestead in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. His father had been a major, important general in the American Revolution. And then in the 20th century, Calvin Coolidge came from a little village called Plymouth Notch in the Green Mountains of Vermont, and almost every house in the village was occupied by a relative of his. And he actually was visiting his father here when the previous president, Warren Harding, unexpectedly died, and his father, who was the Justice of the Peace for this county, swore him in as president in the dining room of this house. He was a person of, aside from his family connection, he was a very modest person, and he actually lived in this house in Northampton, Massachusetts, when he was a lawyer and then later as governor of Massachusetts. And he still is, to this day, the only president who lived in a double house, where, or if the English would call it a semi-detached house, where he didn't own the whole house. Of course, the Kennedy compound is very famous. It's 3 houses plus some other buildings, and which is still very much in use by the family today at Hyannisport, which is right at the entrance to Cape Cod, and it's a wonderful vacation spot for the family, even though the children are scattered all over. And then even with a greater connection to St. Louis is Walker's Point and Kennebunkport, which is where the Bush family summered, and it's named for David D. Walker, who was the founder of the Esley and Walker Dry Goods Company here in St. Louis. And there are many Walkers, like Bert Walker, who just died not too long ago, who are still active here in St. Louis. And they also have a share in this house and have to work out a schedule of who gets to visit. It's like having a timeshare, except it's by birth. Many presidents built or expanded houses while they were in the presidency because they wanted to maintain the image of the elder statesman when they retired. And I was just looking at how old these presidents were, and most of them were still in their 50s or 60s when they left the White House. Unlike today when they're pushing 80. But this is a model of the house that John Tyler bought not very far from Berkeley Plantation, which we looked at earlier. He had 15 children, and so the house that he lived in a few miles from here, Greenway, was not large enough. So he bought this house and expanded it toward the end of his term, about 1844, and he lived here another 30 years. So, and it still is owned by the family today. Here's a picture of it. It's, of course, impossible to take a picture of the whole thing because it's so long. James Polk was from a family that had long connections in Tennessee, and there are several Polk houses other than his, but he built this house while he was in the White House, and unfortunately he lived less than a year after he left office. He didn't feel well, and so he didn't run for a second term, even though he had been successful in the Mexican War and would have been reelected if he had run. And so they buried him in this monument in the front yard. And eventually this house was torn down for office buildings as Nashville grew, but the monument was moved to the state capitol grounds, and you can see it there today, just a few blocks from the Polk Place site, original site. Martin Van Buren was one of the, Van Buren and the Roosevelts were the presidents who reflected the original Dutch settlement of New York. They both could trace their ancestry not to England but to Holland. And Kinderhook was almost all Dutch settlement, even though it was really occupied after the British had taken over in the late 17th century. And this was really an 18th century house, but when Van Buren, who was from this town, but a much smaller house, had an opportunity to buy it, he hired one of the leading architects in the country, Richard Upjohn, to change the style to the Italian villa style, which was very popular at the time. And that's how the National Park Service has restored it today. Another New York house was Millard Fillmore's house. He was the vice president for Zachary Taylor and didn't expect to become president, but he was able to build this house right on the main town square in Buffalo, and it was still there at the turn of the century. Unfortunately, there are a lot of jokes now about who was Millard Fillmore. Nobody remembers who he was, so there was no groundswell to save his house. But this is my favorite picture of any presidential house, with looks like Penrod and Sam, who were playing with the water spigot there in the foreground. Grover Cleveland was a lawyer who was another Presbyterian minister's son, and he had a modest home. He, of course, married in the White House for the first time, and so as his family was expanding, he bought this house in Princeton. He didn't have any family connection there, but he just liked the intellectual environment. And this house is still owned by Cleveland's descendants today. And another one of the post-presidential houses that I particularly admire is the home of William Howard Taft, who was not very successful as a one-term president, defeated by Wilson in 1912. But in 1921, he became the Chief Justice. He's the only president who also served in the judicial branch of our government, and he served as Chief Justice for over 10 years. This is now an embassy office building. But right down the street, in walking distance, is the house that Woodrow Wilson retired to, the man who defeated him. And this house is a museum. It was left by his widow to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and gives you a wonderful idea of what 100 years ago people lived like in these beautiful colonial revival mansions. The Hoovers became famous because of the education they had received as charity students at Stanford University, and they were in the first graduating class at Stanford in Palo Alto. Lou Henry was, I think, the first lady who actually had a college degree, and she was the one who designed this house in the Spanish Revival style, which was so popular in the early teens and 20s here in the United States. And eventually they bequeathed this to Stanford University, and it still serves as the chancellor's residence at Stanford. Eisenhower had never had a permanent residence because his entire career was in the military, except for 2 years, I think he served as chancellor of Columbia University in New York. And I'll come to where he lived at that point later. So when he decided to buy a farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, immediately adjacent to Gettysburg National Battlefield, it got a lot of publicity. And of course, a lot of his supporters wanted to help. And even as a child, I can remember when some large businessman gave him a whole herd of pedigreed cattle that he could keep in the barn here, one of those huge Pennsylvania barns. He and Mamie bequeathed this to the National Park Service, and it's used to tell their story, but also to protect the battlefield that was so important to Eisenhower. Richard Nixon was, in his early years as president, decided he needed to have a base in California. That's where his whole career had been until he got involved in in presidential politics and served as vice president for Eisenhower. And so with the help of friends, he was able to buy Casa Pacifica at San Clemente, which is between Los Angeles and San Diego, and it's immediately adjacent to a large military base there, also overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And as a historic preservation person, I thought this was great because I thought this would make a wonderful addition to the national park system if he bequeathed it. But of course, as we know, his career took a different turn, and eventually he had to sell this and move to New York City. So later, his presidential library was established on the site of his birthplace, which I'll come back to. The idea of the birthplace, as I mentioned earlier, was very strong, especially in the early years of saving presidential homes. And of course, it's much easier, less expensive to save a one-room log cabin than it is a huge mansion. And so this was appealing to the people who were trying to take advantage of this connection. But so we have quite a few replicas. Garfield's birthplace was rebuilt not where he was born in Ohio, but on the grounds of his house that we already saw at Lawnfield in Mentor, Ohio. And Fillmore's cabin was built at a state park called Fillmore Glen, which is in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Buchanan's birthplace was in a hollow in southern Pennsylvania that even today there's hardly a major road leading into. So they moved his house to Mercersburg Academy, which is a elite preparatory school in Mercersburg. And of course, our Grant's Hardscrabble log cabin was moved 3 times before it was saved by August Bush Sr. and moved to Grant's farm, but not to the original location. It's about a mile south of where it was originally. And oh, by the way, if you go to see the new World's Fair exhibit at the Historical Society, there's a model of the entire grounds of the World's Fair, and you can spot Hardscrabble there. It's on Art Hill, just east of the Art Museum. Let's see here. Of course, the main house and the site of Hardscrabble was Whitehaven, which has been restored by the National Park Service, mainly through the efforts of people from St. Louis County, and particularly from the Afton area, who campaigned to save it. And this is the color that Grant painted the house when he owned it. It's called Paris Green. And if you haven't heard this, when you tour the house, they say, please don't lick the walls because the color is made with arsenic. Andrew Johnson was a person who came from very humble beginnings, and he made his fortune through being a tailor primarily until he got into politics. And this picture here on the left shows the way it looked in Greenville, Tennessee. But below there is the building that was built to protect it because it was in very poor condition. And in this picture on the right, you can actually see it wasn't really built with full logs. It was just built with strips of wood, and there were big gaps between them. So it was very primitive. We think of log cabins primarily, but there were plenty of other small houses. This is Ulysses Grant's birthplace in Point Pleasant, which is about an hour east of Cincinnati on the Ohio River. And he liked St. Louis much better than he liked Ohio. And on the left is the a replica of Chester Arthur's birthplace, which is only about a mile from the Canada border at the north end of Vermont. And they're not, this is another place where they're not sure exactly where the cabin was. And of course, everybody says they don't want to tell where it was because it might have been in Canada. And Hoover's birthplace, the exact antithesis of the magnificent house he built in Palo Alto, was so small that originally they couldn't get the stove into the house and kept it on the back porch. And then subsequently he and his wife were buried there. I mentioned Richard Nixon's birthplace. Historically, this is quite interesting because it was built from a kit, like a Sears house, and it was built by his father, who was not a wealthy man but had 4 sons and had to provide some shelter for them. And since the big library building has been built, the whole site has been reversed. So the original entrance to the house is at the bottom, but you approach the house from the library now, which is in the back. So this is, most people will show you the snapshot at the top there, not knowing that's the back. I was surprised to learn that the Bush family restored this house where they lived in the 1940s, when George first moved to Midland, Texas, which was the center of the oil industry, and began his career, which was far removed from the interests of his family at that time. And this is where George W. Bush was born. And today this is owned by the state of Texas. Now, there are quite a few presidents who've been involved with New York, but there's only one property that is open to the public that's involved with him. And I think that's because of just the general difficulty of establishing a historic site in New York, and of getting people to come there to see a house museum when there's so many other things to do in New York City. And this is the entrance to the Waldorf Astoria, which I'll come to in a minute. Theodore Roosevelt, as I mentioned earlier, was born right near Gramercy Park on East 20th Street. And the smaller picture on the left shows the house with these 3 kind of sun porches tacked onto the front of it after the original setbacks had ceased to be used by most of the properties on the street. And it was torn down in 1919, and Roosevelt died the same year. So people were very upset that they had done that, and a group of his friends got together and rebuilt it after it had only been torn down a year or 2. And it's actually significant because it was the new house was designed by a woman architect, Theodate Pope, from Hartford, Connecticut. So this is one of the few opportunities people have to see the inside of a brownstone in New York City, which was the standard form of housing in the 19th century. But the house that has attracted more tourists is Sagamore Hill, which was their weekend and summer place on Long Island, which was easy to get to from New York because of the train system at that time. And this is also a great example of that shingle-style architecture, which was so characteristic of the late 19th century. Chester Arthur lived downtown, and he was actually the head of the federal agency that collected tariffs, the customs officer. And these are 2 different views of the house. In the one on the right, it's the house to the right of the brownstone that has been painted white. But on the left, you can see in more recent years, the whole street has been remodeled, and now the house is the brownest one. But it's still totally unremodeled. And they probably never will, because the stoop, which was the big staircase that's typical of brownstones, that takes you up to the first floor, up almost a full story above the street. All those porches were, stoops were removed when the road was widened many years ago. Here's another townhouse, the grayish one to the right. That's was actually designed by Franklin Roosevelt. And on the inside, it's 2 units, one for him and one for his mother, Sarah. And they were connected on every floor, though, and people speculated how it must have driven Eleanor crazy to have her mother-in-law constantly underfoot in their house, even though nominally they were in separate houses. FDR also redesigned the front of his house in Hyde Park, which was his summer and weekend house, also easily accessible by train going up the Hudson River. And he added 2 large rooms, which enabled him to have large meetings and family gatherings there. And this is where, of course, he built his library. This house became so busy that Eleanor also asked if she could have a retreat. So FDR built Valkill for her, which is about a mile inland from the main house. And this today is the only national site in the national park system that's specifically dedicated to a first lady rather than the president. This was the house which she lent to some friends. And then when she decided she wanted to move there, she had to take the workhouse, which is this L-shaped space, and renovate it for herself. And she had, of the 5 children, there were 19 marriages, I think, and she had many grandchildren. So she took the barn and redesigned it as a kind of a recreation building, and that's really fascinating to see. Now, both Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower resided at various times in their careers at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which is on Park Avenue, a few blocks north of Grand Central Station, and right next door to the St. Bartholomew's Church, which you can just barely see at the bottom of this picture to the right. But it's noted for those 2 towers. And Hoover lived for more than 20 years in one of the towers. And Eisenhower lived here while he was at Columbia. Hoover and Truman just lived here for a shorter time after he was in the White House. And then most recently we have Trump Tower. And I learned when I looked for a picture of this that half of the pictures in Google Images, which you can search by the name Trump Tower, but half of the images actually represent the house, the building across the street on the west side of Washington, of Fifth Avenue. This is on the east side, and the lower kind of buff-colored building is Tiffany's, which is famous from the movie. You can still recognize the front of it.
Thank you, Esley. What a wealth of information you provided and work putting this together. Thank you so much. And I know it is 4 o'clock when we told you we'd let you out of here at 4, but would you be willing if we have 1 or 2 questions? Sure. Is there anybody that might have a question or 2? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Are we
Well,
good?
you have all the information on the handout, so you can look at that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good. Wonderful.